Good morning, everybody. We are beginning in James chapter 1. We're going to slow things down a little bit as we get into these last few classes. We only have 4 more classes to get through the book of James, and then we'll have kind of a overview class at the end. So 5 Sundays left. So we're going to kind of slow stuff down. As you can tell, we're nearing the end of James chapter 1. As per our lineup for this quarter, we're taking everything in kind of James 1 as a summary for the entire book. As you notice, and I think you noticed it last week, we'll notice it, especially this week, we'll notice it a lot, next week, the week to come. But as James goes through the book, he kind of amps up his rhetoric. James chapter 1 is a good outline for the book, but it's also kind of subdued. He speaks in generalities, he speaks kind of in broad themes. As he goes throughout the book, he gets much more anxious, I guess that's a good word, but he gets more blunt. And so his dialogue, his speech, his rhetoric is much more intense. And so that's kind of what we'll see this morning when we look at James chapter 1. We'll look at verses 18 through 22, or 19 through 22, as you can see behind me. 22 bleeds into the next section. Next week is the big faith versus works discussion. When we get to chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, you'll see that kind of intense rhetoric that he has later in the book. Before we begin, though, I'm going to ask Brother Travis Christian, who wasn't sure if he was going to show up this morning, I'm going to ask him to lead us in a word of prayer.
Almighty Father, we thank you for loving us so much, for always being on our side, and watching over us and taking care of us. Father, we thank you for your word. We pray that you'll help us to appreciate your word the way we should and love your word the way we should. Father, we pray that you'll be with us during this hour and help us to put earthly things out of our minds and concentrate on the things we're doing here.
Amen. Thank you. We won't go through all of these 7 verses like we normally do. We just kind of do a big run through. But what happened in the verses leading up to verse 19? What happens in verses 12 down through verse 18? We took it in 2 classes, but they're kind of one big theme. Go ahead, Dad. I know you're
Talking about temptation.
Yeah, temptation is the first several verses, verses 12 down to verse 14. What else is he talking about there? 12 through 18 as a whole. Right. A faithful and loving God, we don't blame our sins on Him, even though we have sins. And so it kind of does, and I think this is kind of what Joyce was getting at. If not, I'm going to put some words in her mouth. But when you look at verses 12 through 18 as a whole, they're kind of a good discussion about the nature of God. What do we find out about the nature of God in verses 12 through 18? Because understanding this, and this is one of those things that's easier said than done, understanding 12 through 18 goes a long way in understanding who God is as a whole. What do we find out about the nature of God in 12 through 18?
God is a giving God. He does not do anything before.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, that He's a giving God. I don't know if putting things in front of us that we shouldn't or we can't handle, I don't know which one of those is better. But you're exactly right. God does not allow us, as 1 Corinthians 10 would say, God does not allow us to be tempted above that which we were able. And so you kind of see shades of that here in verses 12 through 18. But as you mentioned, especially the second half of 12 through 18, verses 17 and 18 kind of pivot around the idea that God gives everything good. All good and perfect blessings come from Him. That's a fundamental principle that we need to understand. We discussed that at length last week. What else do we see? And I think this is what Dad hit on a second ago. Yeah, He doesn't play favorites. I know several people that would argue with that statement. But yes, God does not play favorites. What else do you see in 12 through 15 in that first section?
Well, to me, it looks like He says He's not tempted and He doesn't tempt anyone.
Right. He's not tempted and He doesn't tempt anyone. Exactly. So when you look at 12 through 18 as a whole, we understand a couple of core principles about God. Number one, that He's the giver of all good things and that nothing bad comes from His hand. We also understand kind of the flip side of that He doesn't tempt us, that's not His nature. One of flows into the other. If God can't tempt us, if He Himself can't be tempted by evil, then He's naturally not going to give us evil gifts. And so I think you kind of see that progression in verses 12 through 18. The temptation, of course, is what in verses 12 through 14? What's the temptation for us as humans in 12 through 14?
Just think that temptation actually comes from God.
Right. Right, that He's just kind of tempting us for some reason. Right, and it's very similar to Job, but it's not Job kind of in the same way. Job is a little slightly different idea. But you're right, we tend to say what? If something bad happens in our life, what? Why did... Yeah, God's punishing me, or why is God allowing me to go through this type of stuff? What else is the temptation in verses 17 and 18? What is our temptation as humans? When,
bad things are going on, that's responsible.
right, when bad things, and that's kind of the summation of 12 through 18 also, when bad things are happening, it's God's fault. When good things are happening, it's it's because of us. I don't know if fault's the right word. But when good things are happening, it's because of us. The pivot verse is in verse 16. What does verse 16 say in that section? Do not be deceived, exactly.
Don't kid yourself.
Yeah, don't kid yourself. There's a lot of phrases that we'll see, especially this morning, that you could put them in modern day terms and you would see kind of the full force of what he's talking about. Verse 16 is exactly the same way as Linda mentioned. Don't kid yourselves, my beloved brethren. Every good thing and every perfect gift comes from above. We talked a lot about this section on 12 through 18 discusses the nature of God. When you go into verses 19 through 22, this is when the lines are kind of blurred. James doesn't obviously have he doesn't have verse breaks and chapter breaks, and so the line is not necessarily as hard as it is in verse 19. But he says in verse 19, "This you know, my beloved brethren." There's a lot of dispute about what maybe he's talking about what he just said, whether he's talking about what he's about to say. I think you can obviously make it both ways. But when you look at verses 19 through 22, he's obviously discussing a somewhat different subject that builds on that core principle of understanding the nature of God. Verses 19 down through verse 22, this is our text for this morning. He says, "This you know, my beloved brethren, that everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves." When he says, verses 19, "This you know, my beloved brethren," it obviously applies to the back end, but what is he saying in the future? When he begins this section, 19 through 22, by saying that, what does he mean? "This you know, my beloved brethren," then 19 through 22.
We're kind of tying it in because he's just sit there and said that, don't be, God's not intention.
Right,
And this you know.
right.
But if you're going to sit there and start blaming God for tempting you and all your troubles, you need to kind of just regroup and say, hey, slow it down.
Right.
And realize that you're angry at God for making everything in your life miserable.
Right, exactly. Just because you're angry about stuff in your life doesn't mean that you're justified in being angry about God. And there's a lot of that arrogance in these sections. We'll get to that, especially when we get to chapter 4, verses 11 through 12. But there's a lot of that presumed arrogance. I can speak for God, I can judge for God, that type of stuff. And I think you're right. I think that's exactly what he's addressing here, is that kind of arrogance. Yes?
There's a change that's sought of God, and it's an action.
Right.
The main focus is doing those things, and don't just listen, don't just read, don't just
Right.
hear the word, but get away from evil. Don't let your anger ruin your righteousness.
Right.
So,
Right. Understanding the nature about God, don't let what you think, don't let your thoughts impact your actions in a negative way. I think that's a good way to put it too. Yeah, and especially when you get to verse 22, that's when he really dives into the whole idea of not just thinking about things, but actually doing them. So that's the emphasis that he puts on. When he says in verse 19, "This you know, my beloved brethren," what does that mean? What's the modern day version of that statement? "This you know, my beloved brethren." Which notice how he revisits the word brethren over and over and over again. Right, you've heard this before, or I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. And so a lot of chapter 1 is the same idea. Nothing is brand new. The nature of God in verses 12 through 18 is nothing new about that. That's not, understanding that is not the hard part. What's the hard part of verses 12 through 18? Understanding that God is not evil and that he gives good gifts, that's not the hard part. Exactly. The hard part is putting it into practice. And so when you take that same idea and you flash it forward, which I don't know what that phrase even means, but when you look at verse 19 and he says that everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, the same principle applies. Everyone knows that you should be slow to listen, you should be slow to speak, and quick to hear, whatever that thing meant, whatever I meant by that. But I guess everybody doesn't know it because I don't know it. But what's the hard part of that? If he says everyone knows this, what's the hard part of that? Doing it, exactly. Why is that hard for us? And we'll revisit this a little bit more here in a second, but why is that hard to be, and I'll read it, quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger?
We know what all's happening with that square.
Right. Ironically, 3 people spoke at the same time when I mentioned that phrase, slow to speak. Yeah, because we know the right thing to do, but we don't necessarily want to do it. Paul, go ahead. It's true. Paul, go ahead.
In verse 17, talks about God
Right.
That's what this whole passage is about, and we need to try to emulate that.
Right.
And if we're very off center, it's our fault. We need to be like God, and we need to be self-disciplined.
Right, exactly. And that's not to say that God is slack, as 2 Peter chapter 3 would talk about. He's not lazy in enacting his promises, but he does have a mode of patience and long-suffering that we would do well to emulate in our own lives. I think that's a good point. Linda, go ahead.
Let me say I think for the most part, we tend to just react.
Right.
To someone without thinking.
We are, exactly. We are, unfortunately, reactionary creatures, and I'm right at the front of this. I have a hard time listening to somebody before I want to speak, and so that's a big fault of mine. But you're exactly right. We are, by nature, reactionary creatures. And so when someone says something or does something, our instinct is to react against it or to fight back or to kick back. It's not always to listen through all of this or to listen through the entire explanation, but nothing's more pivotal to inter-church relationships than something like that. To listen to somebody else, to be slow to speak, to slow to react, to give them the time it needs for us to understand the whole situation. Lee?
It also takes a lot of discipline to hold yourself back
Right.
and everything, and to listen and be slow to speak, but you just want to jump in there and say
Right.
your piece.
Yeah.
So discipline has a lot to do with it.
Right, and that's a little bit of what Paul was mentioning, but you're right, that self-discipline, the ability to hold yourself back and get the whole story before you react. Because oftentimes when we jump in, when we've only heard part of the story, it's going to be haywire. We very rarely react in the right way. And so to get the whole story, to listen, to think through things is important. And this is one of those things, by the way, that we always are very eager to say, yes, Howard has a problem with that. But it's very hard for us to say, I have a problem with that. And I think that's the full force of verse 19. This you know, my beloved brother. We all know it. It's just hard to actually put it into practice. Exactly. Yes?
I just wonder when James is writing this, if he, based on his personal experience, is thinking about Peter when he's writing this. Because all throughout the Gospels, Peter is quick to say exactly what's in his brain.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if James is thinking about all those times when Jesus would, like the Transfiguration, when Peter's immediately, well, let us build 3 tabernacles. Well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Well, none of the other guys shushed him, but you're right. I mean, granted, this James is probably a different James. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think this James is the brother of the Lord, not necessarily James, the son of Zebedee. But you're right. I mean, arguably, you could make most of the New Testament about this. Don't do this because Peter did it. Don't do this because you saw Peter do that. A lot of the things that people say in the Scripture, we see in Peter, and I think we see in ourselves. And so, yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up. But I do think I think you're onto something that I was going to talk about a little bit later, but the specific context of what he's talking about here. When you look at James chapter 1, who's the audience for the entire book? Who's the audience for the entirety of this chapter? Right, dispersed Jews, exactly. And if he's writing it from Jerusalem, what's the scenario that James is writing from? If he's writing it from Jerusalem, 80, 50, 55, somewhere in that neighborhood, what's the scenario that he's writing from? Right. They're going through the early persecution, and not imperial persecution. The Roman persecution would come much later. Yeah. Right, from the Jews. And that's the difference between imperial persecution and Jewish persecution. Imperial persecution is much more formalized. It's we're going to go in and we're going to just take everybody. Jewish persecution is much more spontaneous. I would argue in many ways it's much more violent. And so if he's writing from that context, and Jerusalem is the epicenter of all this persecution, the temptation, of course, in verse 19 would be when you're brought upon false charges, when people try to come after you, when they seek slander against you, be slow to speak. Don't react immediately. And I think you see that very well in the image of Christ. When Jesus is at his crucifixion or at his trial, what does he do?
He asks questions.
Yeah.
He got by asking questions that
Right.
force them to actually reflect back on themselves.
Right. He asks questions, right. He asks questions of Pilate, he asks questions of them. And I would encourage everybody, if you have the time this afternoon, this week sometime, I would encourage you to read John's his dialogue of the crucifixion, the trial. I think it starts around chapter 19, because John is writing from somebody who was most likely there. You can see that in chapter 19, that he goes into that courtyard where Jesus is being persecuted at. The other disciples are gone. Now, all of them write under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but John's dialogue is much more personal, and I think you can see that in his writings. And so if John is sitting there looking at Jesus and describing the manner in which he presents himself, that's what you see from John's gospel. He's much more, not subdued, but he's not quick to incriminate himself.
That's what I say, they keep throwing charges at you.
Right. Exactly. He just doesn't respond.
Tell the right charge, which is he's the son of God.
Right. Which if you, yeah, and that's true. That is the correct one.
I
Right.
mean, yeah.
And that's the interesting thing about John's narrative, is if you look at John's narrative, they ask him, you know, are you the king of the Jews, or are you a king? He's like, why are you asking me these questions? Go and talk to the people who heard me. That's the way you're going to find out the truth. And so when he gets before Pilate, Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? If you say so, and that's the way some translations would put that. So Jesus doesn't defend himself as much as he lets his works and his words kind of do the talking. I think you see shades of that in what what James is talking about here. Peter says much the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 3 when he says, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter, he opens not his mouth. And so there's a lot of wisdom in the way that Jesus handled himself. I saw like 3 hands pop up, and I don't want to overlook them. Did anybody have anything? 3 shy hands now, I guess. Look at verse 20, because we'll jump back to verse 19 here in a second. But when you look at verse 20, to me, this is the meat of all of this. In verse 20, when he says, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. That's a huge verse that I think speaks a lot of different types of things. But what does James mean when he says the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God?
The anger of man tends to be self-centered. You did something to me, I'm going to get you.
Right. I would say, to take it a step further, I would say the anger of man overwhelmingly is self-centered. Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. We tend to want to fight for ourselves or defend ourselves. Yeah. What else do you think he means by this in James 1:20?
Self-control.
Right. Have self-control. Right. What else does he mean by this?
Can't be righteous and be angry at the same time.
Well, Jesus with a whip, I think, would disagree with you. I think actually it says, zeal for thy house has consumed me. Yeah.
They'll take righteous judgment.
That's true.
Well,
That's true. I don't oftentimes get to be right when you speak up in class, so I'm just going to enjoy this for a second. Yeah, oftentimes righteousness, though, is not accompanied by holiness. I think all of us would agree with that to a certain extent. And yeah, if you find yourself in the temple and they're exchanging money, feel free to grab a whip and go after them. But that's not oftentimes the scenario we find ourselves in. What else does he mean, though, here in James chapter 1, verse 20? And I think Jeff hit on this a little bit. When we're angry, what's our sole pursuit? Selfishness is most likely it, right? But how do we convince ourselves? When we're, I don't know why I keep coming back to this. Russ brought it up, I'm going to bring it up all the time too. It's just, I guess, I have it, guys. But when you get cut off in traffic, what's your natural inclination? Get even. That was very broad that you didn't have to incriminate yourself, yes.
I wonder if part of this is like, you just want to make sure everybody knows you're right.
Bingo. Exactly. Or not necessarily that everybody knows that I'm right, but that everyone knows that what?
He's wrong.
He's wrong, exactly. That justice is here, and he's over here. And so the anger, my anger sometimes when I'm cut off in traffic, is to cut them off to prove a point to them, that they were wrong in what they did. That message is rarely ever, if communicated. What does that usually accomplish, though? Well, it accomplishes something. What does it accomplish? Escalation. And Amarillo, it counts for, I think, 3 or 4 deaths a year. You see that on the news all the time, where people are cut off, and then some road rage happens, and one car flips over. So you see that happen from time to time. What does it really accomplish, though? We had something.
Well, I just said more anger, which is what you just said.
Right. More anger, escalation, nothing good. Always ends up being something bad. And that's really what he's driving at here. So when he says in James chapter 1 and verse 20, the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God, what does that mean? That my anger at things does not accomplish what?
It's simple.
It's sinful, true, but it doesn't accomplish what? It doesn't accomplish righteousness. Right, it doesn't...
You're not reflecting what we're supposed to imitate God.
Right. We're supposed to imitate God as much as possible, yeah. And my anger at that situation does not achieve holiness. And I think Sandra nailed it. Go ahead, George.
What's the difference between the anger of man and righteous anger?
Right. And that's what Nathan was getting at. So, yeah. I just had to, it's just a moment. But go ahead. What is the difference between the anger of man and the anger of God? Because that's the context of what he's talking about here.
Well, man can possess righteous anger.
Right.
Verses that talk about that. So this verse is talking about the anger of man.
Right.
It seems like there's a right way and a wrong way to be angry.
Right.
One is completely bad, and the other one, managed correctly, is okay.
Well, I think you're right. Yeah, one managed correctly is okay. That's the righteous anger that you're talking about. And that's hard for us sometimes to manage that correctly because our emotions come into it. Lee, go ahead.
We go back to what we were talking about, discipline.
Mhm.
And if you go forward up here to this implanted word, so when we discipline ourselves to do what God tells us to do,
Right.
anger won't have control over us.
Right, if we're able to hold ourselves back, which of course, as I think we mentioned last week, the hardest verse in the entire Bible is be angry and yet sin not. That's, in my opinion, the hardest verse of all in the New Testament. Self-control is what brings that back. It's what reins that in. So that's an excellent point. Yeah.
There's also a verse that says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Right.
So revenge is not our responsibility.
I really thought you were going to say revenge is a dish best served cold. I thought that's where you were going to go with that. You're right. Revenge is not, it's not our ability. And I think to kind of piggyback off of that, to say that I'm going to take wrath for myself leaves no room for the wrath of God, which is what he mentions there, I think, in Hebrews 13.
Or stealing from God.
Exactly. You're stealing the justice from God that God would take. You've basically done it yourself. Yeah. And I think all of these are good points. But what's the fundamental difference between righteous anger and our anger? Bingo. Our goal. What is our goal when we're personally affronted and we're angry?
Make myself feel better.
Right. Make myself feel better. Right. I'm going to cut you off, and that obviously solves everything. Right. You said that with a really sinister look in your eye, even the score. Yeah, our anger is about making ourselves happy, gratifying ourselves. What's the goal of righteous anger?
Uphold God's
Right.
rules.
To uphold God's rules, to uphold God's standards, which if you remember, and this goes back to the righteous anger of Jesus with the whips, the flashpoint for all of that is when he says, or when he quotes the Old Testament, or I think John quotes the Old Testament, that they have made my house or God's house a den of thieves. So he's not angry because he's personally affronted. He's angry because God has been affronted. That's what you see in David and Goliath, for instance, when David comes out and he says that Goliath has insulted the Lord of hosts. That's where you see over and over again that type of righteous anger. That's the difference between righteous anger and the anger of man. You see this also, I think, within this. If you were to look at what the difference is between righteous anger and mankind's anger, and the reason that the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God, is it doesn't produce justice. If I cut somebody off in traffic, what does that really accomplish?
It's selfishness.
It's selfish. But it doesn't really accomplish anything. Nobody's made better, nobody's corrected by it. So it doesn't actually produce justice. I would argue that it makes us deaf too as well. When you look at what Jesus says concerning the beam and the motes, what does he mean by that? The mote in your eye, the beam in his eye. What's the whole point of that teaching?
Make sure you're in line before you try to talk about
Right, make sure you're in line before you try to talk to somebody else. But I think also what he mentions specifically on the back end of that phrase, when he says you can't see to get the speck out of your brother's eye when you have a mote in your own eye, is you literally can't detect sin because why? You can't detect
it yourself.
Well, you're so neat. Right. If you could detect sin righteously, then what would you do to yourself?
correct.
You would correct it, exactly. And so if I can't even detect sin in my own life, I'm obviously not qualified to detect sin in anybody else's life. Howard?
We talk about vengeance of mine, I will put a face as a law.
Right.
If we remember that, we're not going to fly off the handle with it, so.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Because it's a little lack of faith.
Mhm.
I mean, God said he's going to settle the score,
Right.
and it's not by God.
Yeah.
And so,
And that's true. I mean, and I like what you said there, especially about how trying to take vengeance for ourselves shows a lack of faith on God's part. If we believe that we've been wronged, we should rely on God to handle that. But as you mentioned, if we take the justice for ourselves, then we don't trust that God's eventually going to handle it. And so you're right. We have to have that right perspective. Once again, all of that falls into the purview of easier said than done. Because it's easy to say, God's going to take care of things until you get in that moment. And then it's all about self-justification and self-vengeance, right? It also, I would argue, too, destroys communities. And that's what we were getting into earlier when we discussed the context of this passage. If James is arguing for here in James chapter 1, my beloved brethren, everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, and he kind of couches it all within interpersonal relationships. What does being angry and not listening, what does that accomplish within a church? What does that accomplish within a family?
Well, everybody quit speaking to each other, and like I say, the next time you meet up, everybody's going to be able to do.
That's That's very accurate, yeah. That families stop talking to each other. The only time they see each other is that when somebody dies and then they have to sit next to each other. Yeah, nothing is more awkward than that, but you're exactly right. How does anger destroy churches, right?
Well, usually anger produces anger.
Right.
And it's just like the domino theory going out away from itself.
Right.
And if it's not corrected when it's still that one domino, once it starts to fall, it's hard to rein back in and get under control.
Right.
And pretty soon, usually, if it's in a church, you've got a division.
Yeah.
You know, my side against your side.
Right.
And it'll destroy a church in a heartbeat if it's not corrected.
And that's exactly right. And then a year later, you wonder to yourself, well, what did this all start from? And after the finger pointing is over, it's the smallest minute thing. And then a decade later, you're like, well, why did that church split? Well, it's because of this. Well, why did this create that? And that's what we fail to realize, is that it does escalate. Yeah.
Well, and the other part of that is, usually it starts with one person. If that one person is not dealt with, even if he is dealt with and he decides to leave, that's better than half the congregation leaving. And like you said, a year later, what did we split over? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And there are
mine. You know, I think it needs to be addressed when it's still young.
And that's exactly right. And this is not a commentary on eldership at all. I'm not saying that. But I've seen elderships that refuse to deal with things because they don't want to appear dictatorial, or they don't want to appear as lording it over, or they don't want to be perceived as harsh. And a church splits anyways as a result. And usually it's much more catastrophic than that had it just been handled. Yeah, Karen, and then we'll get to Rosa.
Ken always uses the term historical, being historical about stuff. In other words, you get angry about one thing, and then when you start going back and forth, you start going back.
Right.
You know, it's like I can go back to the childhood and say, well, you did this to me all those years ago. Well, you know, at some point in time, God doesn't do us that way. If we ask for forgiveness, God forgives.
Right.
And He doesn't bring it up 55 years from now.
Yeah,
You know
and
what I'm saying?
acts as if it hadn't happened. Right.
Right.
Now, he does remember it, because if people just continue in it, he'll say, look, and you see that in the prophets, look, this has been going on for a long time.
Right.
But if you ask for forgiveness, as long as you stay faithful, he doesn't remember it. He acts like it never happened in the first place, which is true
But
forgiveness.
in anger, it's
Right.
easy to just bring up stuff. Yes.
That's true. I'm glad
I
Melinda
would
is not
never
here.
do that, but some of my
Yes. All right, now your brother's going to speak
I'm
up.
going to the lightning bolts coming.
Ken, feel free to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
About that. What I was going to say is, you asked how it's destroyed, because half the people are angry with the other half, and nobody wants to talk to anybody. And I think we've all been in congregations. You go in, you can tell when there's a problem, because nobody talks to you. Everybody's sitting down immediately, and
The first year I was here, it was
feel
like
coldness
that.
in the air. I've been places that way, and you can
Yeah.
just feel the tension. And you know, it's
Right.
one of the blessed things about this place. Everybody is happy to see everybody.
Right. And I would
It's
agree.
a hard
Yeah.
thing to keep. It's a great thing to have. Sometimes it's a hard thing to keep that.
Right, and that's the hardest part, is a church splits oftentimes because of anger, but it's usually when there's a lot of egos involved. And you're exactly right. You can walk into a church and feel whether or not they're at war with each other within seconds. And I was just joking earlier, I do agree that's one of the great things about this church, is we're very much at peace, at least as far as I know. Jason's been looking at me, kind of awkward, but yeah, we're at peace as far as I know, and I think that's a really, really special blessing that not a lot of churches get to experience, especially for as long as I've been here, 10 plus years. So I think that's really powerful, and I think that's really important. Let's get Howard, and then we need to keep moving. Go ahead.
Someone said anger is like acid. It destroys the vessel that's in it.
Yeah.
It destroys its own self. Where anger, sometimes it grows and grows and gets worse and
Right.
worse over the years.
That's true. I've heard of anger as being described as being mad at somebody else and shoot yourself in the leg, because it really only hurts yourself. And so, yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Let me ask you this: when you talk about this, the idea of an anger man not achieving the righteousness of God, you see this in local churches. We see it with us as regular Christians. But what's one of the qualifications of elders? That's mentioned in both Titus and Timothy as not being quick to what? Not being quick to anger, exactly. What's the problem when you've got an eldership that's quick to anger? It's bad enough when one of them is quick to anger. What's the problem when 3, 4, 5, all of them are quick to anger?
Stop, going to them for leadership.
That's step one. People will stop going to them for leadership. That's when you really know, that's when the beginning stages of trouble. Well, one of the beginning stages. Yes?
Rash decisions.
Rash decisions made out of emotion and impulse. Yeah. What else is a problem with that? We've got two of our elders here. We're welcome to speak.
That they want their way and don't consider the
Exactly.
congregation and how they feel about it.
Right. This is what I want to do, and I don't care what anybody else thinks about it. That is anger, but it's also ego mixed in heavily with that as well. Paul?
That's what I was going to say. It becomes a dictatorial environment, and no dictatorship survives, certainly not in an environment like this.
Right. Especially not in the 20th century, no dictatorship survives. But you're right. In the church, it can't be like that because an eldership cannot presume to hold the place of God and speak in ways that God hasn't spoken for. And I think you see that same situation taking place here in James 1, especially when you get to James chapter 4. Does somebody else have something? Right, exactly. I would kind of build on this. Not only does an eldership that's angry with the or that is quick to wrath, not only will they turn on the church, they'll turn on each other. And I've seen elderships before in other places where elders are constantly at war with each other, where when they meet, there's almost smoke billowing out of the door just because there's so much anger. And then usually it comes with a pretty violent end. And I think all of us have seen situations like that. And that's why Paul talks about an eldership cannot be quick to wrath, because there are going to be people that bring up things to them that are very unfair. There are going to be people that bring up things about them that are very unfair, and you have to deal with it with temperance and with patience. That comes with wisdom and experience, and both of those are pivotal qualities when it comes to eldership. We get to this kind of triumvirate here of the things that he talks about here, being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. It's a problem when I mix those up. Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. As we mentioned earlier, this is one of those things that's very much easier said than done, but that's one of the things that the scripture is replete with ideas on how to combat. I want 7 people to read for me. If I can get, actually 6. I get 6 volunteers. One for Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. I never do this. Everyone's kind of throw it off. Can I get a volunteer for Proverbs 10, 19? Dad, thank you. Proverbs 14, 29. Good, John. Proverbs 16, 32. Colton, you were anxiously waiting back there. 17, 27. Proverbs 17, 27. All right, Travis, thanks, man. I take back what I said about you not wanting to come earlier. Proverbs 29 and 20. All right, thanks, Brett. And then Ecclesiastes 7, 9. Appreciate you. This side was dominating that field. But all these proverbs, and obviously Solomon has a lot of things to say about this idea of being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. And so it's important to hear all these different aspects of it. There's a reason there's 6 different verses. So we'll just start at the top. Let's start and read these kind of in succession. Proverbs 10 and verse 19. Listen to what Solomon has to say about being quick to anger.
Proverbs 10, 19. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent.
Exactly. Sin is not far behind. Proverbs 14 and 29.
He who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly.
Exactly. The perspective that comes behind being slow to speak. Proverbs 16, 32.
Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city.
I like that one especially because Solomon would build on that and when we get to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. But somebody who can control their spirit is stronger than even the mightiest warrior. Proverbs 17, 27.
He who has knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit.
Okay, so being able to restrain yourself is an example of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 29 and 20.
You see a man who is hasty in his words, there is more hope for a fool.
I like how Solomon kind of waits until the end to kind of touch. Actually, that would be somebody else completely. But to the end of the book to kind of discuss that. Ecclesiastes 7 and 9.
Do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of the fool.
Exactly. What do all those verses teach us about the nature of anger and the value of restraining our tongue? What do all those verses teach us? Nothing good comes from personal wrath. Right, I kind of qualify that a little bit. But what else does that teach us? That's an excellent point. What do those verses teach us? If you want to be wise and mature and holy, what do you have to do at the very beginning?
Think about what you're going to say.
You have to think about what you're going to say. you have to keep your emotions in check. Somebody who's ruled by their emotions is ruled by the wind of the sea, they're ruled by this, they're ruled by that, but somebody who cannot keep their emotions in check is liable for sin and temptation, and that's why I think he builds on all of this, especially here at the end of James chapter 1. When you look back at James chapter 3, for instance, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, but when you look at James chapter 3, and I love how he begins this section, in verse 13, James chapter 3, he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom." In other words, if you claim that you're wise, what should be the proof of that? Self-control, exactly. If you claim to be holy and righteous, what should be the proof of that, according to what he talks about here? Keeping your emotions in check, thinking through things, being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. I think all of those things are important. Thank you to those guys for reading. I appreciate that. The best remedy for this, as we've kind of danced around so far this morning, the best remedy for this is obviously humility. When egos are in play, that's when anger gets flared up very easily. Look at the last section of this. In James chapter 1 and verses 21 and 22, and then we'll jump very quickly to James chapter 4. In James chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. James 1, 21 and 22. "Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves." This is where we fall back again to that same phrase that we mentioned at the beginning of verse 19. You know better than this, guys. Everybody knows what to do. Somebody who hears something and doesn't do it is silly. It's worthless. They look at themselves in the mirror, they go on, nothing changes. Why do we not enact these types of things? We know that we should be slow to speak, quick to hear. Why do we not do it?
I heard, he said, humility.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of anger and so forth is fueled by pride.
Mm-hmm. I think it's exactly fueled by pride. It's because I think that I know better than God, or I think that I can act for God. And that's ultimately the essence of idolatry, that I can speak up for God instead of Him. What does he mention there in verses 21 and 22? In verse 21, what does he say to receive? The implanted word, which is, right, which is being this, the implanted word which is able to do what? Save your souls, exactly. What does that teach us about how to hear the word of God? And that, I think quick to hear is a part of this. Well, what does that teach us about listening?
You really plant anything unless you're listening.
Right. You can't really implant it and put it where it belongs unless you're truly actually listening to it. And that's, to answer the question of why we don't do this type of stuff, it's because we're not really listening. We know that we're supposed to be quick to hear and slow to speak, slow to wrath. I think I got it right that time. But we don't do it because we're not really listening. We say it and we hear it, it's over there, but we always qualify it. We rationalize it, or we do all these different things to it. But when we actually realize that we're supposed to be slow to speak, what does that do to us?
The example here is the soil.
Exactly. That's another New Testament Jesus allusion that he makes. You see it later when you look at James chapter 5. The patient farmer waits for the produce of the crops. There's a lot of patience involved with James. And I think that's one thing you see from start to end. He begins the whole concept talking about persecution. He ends it with prayer. All of it has to do with long-suffering and being patient through that. I want us to look at Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is an interesting phrase, I think, that goes along with James 1. James 1, by the way, that phrase in verse 20 has the best King James Version sentence in the entire Bible, that wickedness. The King James translates that superfluity of naughtiness, and I think that's just a hilarious phrase from beginning to end. That's kind of a side point. Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 11. He says, "For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach." He could almost be parroting James 1 by saying that. This commandment is not too difficult, nor is it out of reach. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us and make us hear it that we may observe it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it that we may observe it. But the word is very near you, in your mouth, in your heart, that you may observe it. What does Deuteronomy 30 teach us about God? About the word, obedience, all the stuff that we talked about? It's accessible. If God was speaking in riddles, and I think you see the beginning shades of Gnosticism that James is addressing here in James chapter 1, but if the word was, like quantum physics, if it was in a language that had been dead for 2,000 years, then could God really expect us to follow it? No. But the fact that it is accessible means what?
We have no excuse.
We have no excuse. The duty is on us to follow. We don't follow it because we do what with it? When we qualify, we rationalize, we do all these different things, what do we do to it? We ignore it, true. Did you say avert it? Oh, pervert it? Yeah, I think that's true. But when we pervert it, what do we ultimately do to it? When God says, don't work on the Sabbath, and the Jews said, well, what that means is you can't take more than 4,000 steps on Saturday. What does that do to it? It doesn't trivialize it. If anything, it makes it... That doesn't nullify it. Everyone's sitting around and maybe I'm just in my own brain. It makes it too difficult. If God says don't work on the Sabbath, that's a relatively easy command to follow. We all know what work looks like. But if somebody comes along and says, well, what that means is that you can't take more than 4,000 steps, that adds another condition and puts layers on top of it that are almost impossible to follow. And I think that's a little bit of what he's addressing here. Somebody have any thoughts or comments? I'll look at James 4.
Didn't Jesus, one of his charges against the Jews was that when they substituted their interpretations, I guess, for what God said, that they nullified God's word.
Right. They did nullify, and I didn't mean to nullify your statements. But I guess where I was coming at it from was, here's the commandments. What they did was they put so many things around it that were impossible to follow, that yes, they made this nullified, but they also put so many conditions that nobody could follow. So that's where I was going at it, but yeah, you're right.
When we make all these conditions around God's words, we make it, inoperable in our lives.
Right. Exactly.
His purpose for all of this.
Exactly. And that's what all of this is about. We could have probably just started with that 30 minutes ago and had no class at all. But we exchange God's purpose for our own purpose. We do what we want to do instead of what God wants to do. And I think that's where James chapter 4 comes in. If you look at James 4, specifically there in verses 11 and 12, we start off this class talking about the rhetoric that James has, especially in the later chapters. And you see it in chapters 3, 4, 5. When you look at in chapter 4, he talks about you who are, let your laughter be turned in the morning, your joy into gloom. Verse 13, come now, you who say. So there's a lot of strong rhetoric in this section. But verses 11 and 12 just kind of slide in the middle of this, and I think speak to both sides of it. But in verses 11 and 12, he says, don't speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother judges his brother, speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? He begins this whole section by saying, do not speak against one another. And he has the world's favorite verse, which says, don't judge one another. This is a close, like a twin sister to Matthew chapter 7. But he says, don't judge one another, because who are you to do that? Obviously, that means we should never pass judgments, right? Wrong. Wrong. What does that mean then in James 4? Motivation behind it?
Jesus says in John 7:24, judge righteous judgment.
Right. Use righteous judgment. I would take that a step further. There's a difference in my mind between judgment and discernment. What's the difference between judgment and discernment? When I'm judging somebody, what am I doing?
You can decide what's right and wrong, discerning it.
Right.
Your judgment is placing sentence.
Right. If I'm judging somebody, then I'm setting my standard. And that's what people kick back against, is I'm setting my standard and you don't meet my standard, therefore you're wrong. That's what people mean when they say don't judge one another. But if I'm discerning something, what's the difference between that? What am I doing if I'm discerning something? Right. Here's God's standard. I'm discerning whether or not people are following. Exactly. And so when you look at James chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, he's not talking about not using righteous judgment. He's talking about not setting yourself up in the seat of God, which is exactly, if you remember Matthew chapter 23, that's exactly what Jesus accused the Pharisees of. They sit in Moses' seat.